It was a warm, sunny Saturday afternoon in Oakwood Hills, the kind of day perfect for a backyard barbecue. Marcus Williams, a tall, confident black man in his early 30s, stood beside the grill, flipping steaks with a relaxed smile. His wife, Sarah, was mingling with their friends, laughing with their new neighbors. Their daughter, Mia, ran around with water balloons, the sound of her giggles filling the air. It felt like the perfect day, as the smell of food blended with the sounds of easy conversation and the distant chirp of birds. As Marcus flipped the burgers, he exchanged a quick glance with Sarah. The kids were playing, the music was at the perfect volume, and everything seemed right. The sense of excitement in the air was palpable. It was the kind of day that marked the beginning of new memories. But little did they know, just down the street, a storm was brewing behind closed curtains. Mrs. Jensen, a longtime resident of Oakwood Hills, watched the Williams family from her window. Her arms crossed tightly in disapproval, her eyes narrowing as she watched the gathering unfold. Her discontent wasn't with anything they had done. It was the idea of those people being too loud, too noticeable in her quiet neighborhood. Feeling irritated, Mrs. Jensen picked up the phone and dialed 911. Her voice was tight with frustration as she reported the noise in the large group. "There's a party going on, and it's getting out of hand," she told the dispatcher. After the call, she leaned back in her chair, a smug smile creeping across her face, believing she had done the right thing. Back at the barbecue, Marcus was still flipping burgers when he noticed a police car pulling up slowly on the curb. The flashing lights weren't on, but the sight of the officer's car alone was enough to send a ripple of unease through the group. The chatter died down as people exchanged nervous glances. Marcus's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his composure. He wiped his hands on a towel and stepped forward, watching as the officer approached. The officer, a tall white man in his late 40s, got out of the car and made his way up the driveway. "Good afternoon, sir," the officer said. "We got a call about a noise complaint and a large gathering. Just need to check things out." Marcus raised an eyebrow, surveying the peaceful scene in the backyard. There were no loud noises or out-of-control behavior. "Everything's fine, officer," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Just a family barbecue, nothing more." Before the officer could reply, Mrs. Jensen appeared at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed and glaring. "I told you," she shouted, her voice dripping with disdain. "There are too many people, too much noise. They don't care about this neighborhood." The officer turned to Mrs. Jensen with an almost bored expression, clearly unimpressed by her outbursts. He looked back at Marcus and his family, then back to Mrs. Jensen. The tension in the air thickened, and the guests at the barbecue waited with bated breath, uncertain of what was coming next. The officer's tone shifted from neutral to stern. "Ma'am," he said, his voice taking on a commanding edge, "I suggest you lower your voice and calm down. This is Captain Marcus Williams, the new police captain for Oakwood Hills." He gestured toward Marcus, his voice unwavering. Mrs. Jensen froze. Her face went pale as the words registered. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time, her earlier smugness evaporating into shock and embarrassment. Marcus didn't move. He just stood there, his expression unwavering. The stillness in the air was deafening. It felt like the world had paused for a moment. Everyone at the barbecue watched in silence, waiting for Mrs. Jensen's reaction. Finally, the officer nodded toward Marcus, offering a subtle but respectful acknowledgement. "Captain Williams," he said, "there's no issue here. You're well within your rights. I'll take care of this." The officer's words carried authority, and the tension started to dissolve. Marcus looked at Mrs. Jensen with a calm but firm gaze. "It's okay, ma'am," he said, his voice low but measured. "But next time if you have a problem, maybe come speak to us directly. We're your neighbors, after all." The words were simple, but they held weight. Mrs. Jensen's face flushed a deep red, her eyes darting between Marcus and the officer. She stammered, trying to find something to say, but her voice failed her. I didn't realize, oh," she muttered, her words trailing off. With one last defeated glance at Marcus, Mrs. Jensen turned on her heel and quickly retreated back to her house. Her earlier bravado had completely vanished. leaving her with nothing but humiliation. The officer looked at Marcus and gave him a small, respectful nod, then turned to leave. As Mrs. Jensen disappeared into her house, the air seemed to lighten. The tension that had hung over the barbecue melted away. The guests slowly began to relax, the uneasy silence broken by a few nervous chuckles. Marcus turned to the officer, nodding his thanks for handling the situation with professionalism. The officer gave a small smile, his demeanor softening as the moment passed. "All in a day's work, Captain," he said, his voice still respectful, but with a touch of camaraderie. He turned to leave, making sure the situation was fully under control. Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Some people just don't know how to mind their business," he muttered under his breath, but his tone was light. His attention returned to the grill, and he flipped a few burgers, a smile returning to his face as the normal sounds of the barbecue resumed around him. Lisa, having watched the exchange from the side, walked over with a playful grin on her face. "Well," she said, "looks like you've made a lasting impression on the neighbors." Marcus glanced at her, his smile widening as he handed her a plate of perfectly grilled food. "Guess the neighborhood knows who's in charge now," Marcus said with a wink, handing her a plate. Lisa laughed and gave him a playful shove, taking the plate. "I think they'll remember that encounter for a while," she said, looking towards Mrs. Jensen's house, still empty and quiet. The group at this barbecue slowly picked up where they had left off, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses filling the air once again. Kids ran past, water balloons in hand, their shrieks of joy blending with the rhythmic sizzle of the grill. The scene returned to its easygoing, carefree vibe. Jason, one of the family friends, leaned over to Marcus and said, "You handled that like a pro, man." Marcus just nodded, taking a deep breath. "Sometimes you've got to let people see who you really are," he said with a shrug. "But hey, this barbecue's about good food and better company." The officer, having made sure everything was in order, finally drove away, the sound of his cruiser fading as it disappeared around the corner. The neighborhood, once again peaceful, returned to its usual rhythms. The Parker family and their friends continued to enjoy the afternoon, savoring the food and the company.